Live from New Delhi, you're watching DD India Global. We'll get you top stories from India and the region. I am Tanvi Taneja, and for news from the rest of the world, I'm joined by my colleague in London, Stuart Smith. Good afternoon, Stuart.
Thank you, Tanvi. Coming up, the IMF is closer to approving a loan of hundreds of millions of dollars to Ukraine. The Swedish Prime Minister is in Hungary to try to ensure Sweden's accession to NATO, and 15 people remain missing after a residential fire in Spain. But first, back to you, Tanvi, for the headlines.
India's External Affairs Minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar, continues to press for UN reforms at the Raisina dialogue in New Delhi, says if G20 can expand, so can the P5. Israeli negotiators likely to participate in truce talks in Paris on Friday. Israel conducts retaliatory attacks on Hamas targets in Gaza. And the United States impose 500 new sanctions on Russia ahead of the second anniversary of its conflict with Ukraine. Russia's Gazprom continues to send gas to Europe via Ukraine despite sanctions. Negotiators from Israel are heading to Paris on Friday to discuss the truce talks with the US, Qatar and Egypt. The team of negotiators will be led by the head of Israel's Mossad intelligence service. The team will put emphasis on a potential deal to free more than 100 hostages under Hamas and a ceasefire. Earlier, Israel's Defense Minister Yoav Gallant said the country's hostage negotiators were being given expanded authority. The last talks on a ceasefire failed 2 weeks ago when Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu rejected Hamas's proposal, calling it delusional. Meanwhile, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has presented an official post-Gaza conflict plan. It outlines Israel's proposal to control security in Gaza and play a role in the public affairs of Gaza after the conflict with Hamas ends. The document also rejects unilateral recognition of a Palestinian state, even as it suggests working with local representatives not affiliated with terrorist countries or groups to replace Hamas's rule in the region. The plan was presented to Israeli cabinet ministers on Thursday. These talks came as the Israeli military continues its operation against Hamas in Gaza. On Friday, the IDF claimed that it killed a terrorist in the West Bank region who was on his way to carry out an attack. The Israeli airstrike targeted Yasser Hanoun, who had carried out several attacks over the past few weeks. DD India's Sarah Coates joins us for more on the story from Tel Aviv now. Sarah, what can we expect from the peace talks in Paris? Is Netanyahu expected to attend?
Hello, Tanvi. This Israeli delegation has just left Israel on the way to the French capital. Benjamin Netanyahu is not with that delegation. You mentioned the head of the Mossad, that is David Barnea, and also the Shin Bet chief. They will be meeting with the head of the CIA, Bill Burns, also the Egyptian spy chief and the Qatari Prime Minister. Now, this decision, Tanvi, to send this Israeli delegation was made in the very early hours of this morning after it was confirmed that a number of these hostages being held in the Gaza Strip had received medicine that was sent to them a number of weeks ago. So there is certainly careful optimism, quiet optimism here in the region that these talks may finally achieve something after the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu pulled out of talks a week or so ago, citing Hamas's demands as delusional. We can report that the head of Hamas, its political bureau, Ismail Haniyeh, he has now left Cairo after 3 days of talks there, while the US Mideast envoy Brett McGurk, he's been here in Israel. He has been talking with Netanyahu, also the Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, with the United States calling these last talks very constructive. So as I mentioned, quiet optimism here in Israel. And Tanvi, according to an anonymous source very close to these talks, there are indications that Israel and Hamas may have reached a preliminary sort of deal to release 35 of these sick and elderly hostages in exchange for an unknown number of Palestinian prisoners.
And Sarah, what more can you tell us about the drone strike in the occupied West Bank city of Jenin?
Tanvi, this happened in the early hours of this morning. We have pretty incredible pictures of this strike on a car in the West Bank refugee camp of Jenin. The Israeli military says that 2 Palestinian Islamic Jihad operatives were on their way to carry out a terror attack. Now, the 2 that have been deceased have been named as Syed Yaradat and also Yasser Hanoun, who has previously been jailed here in Israel for terror offences. Now, since October 7, Tanvi, there really have been an increase in these sort of operations in the West Bank, daily raids happening by the Israeli military, with the IDF saying its intention here is to try and root out terrorists, but people who live in the West Bank say they see it as a form of collective punishment.
Thank you, Sarah, for those updates. Meanwhile, Secretary of State Antony Blinken has said that the United States is focused on getting an agreement on the release of hostages held in Gaza. Blinken was speaking to media on the sidelines of the G20 foreign ministers meeting in Brazil.
We're focused intensely on trying to get an agreement that results in the release of the remaining hostages and that produces an extended humanitarian ceasefire.
Tomorrow, February 24th, will mark the second anniversary of Russia-Ukraine conflict. The US is targeting Russia with more sanctions on Friday. My colleague Stuart Smith is in London. He gives us more on this and other stories making headlines around the world. Stuart, this will be the latest of thousands of sanctions against Russia.
Yes, on the eve of the second anniversary of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, US President Joe Biden has announced more than 500 new sanctions against Russia for its conflict with Ukraine and also the death of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny. The White House has said these sanctions will target individuals connected to Navalny's imprisonment as well as Russia's financial sector, defense industrial base, procurement networks and sanctions evaders across multiple continents. On the sidelines of a G20 foreign ministers meeting in Brazil, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said all the G20 nations want Russia's aggression to end and peace to prevail in the region.
On Ukraine, there is a strong, palpable desire among virtually all of the G20 for the Russian aggression to end and for peace to prevail in a way that upholds the rights of Ukrainians to their freedom, to their future, to the territorial integrity of their country. And that was very clear in the meetings
Ukrainian
that we had over
President
the last 2
Volodymyr
days.
Zelensky said it would be a tragedy for his countrymen and all of Europe if his nation is left to survive without any further weapons aid from the United States.
Will Ukrainians survive without Congress support? Of course, but not all of us. And if we understand this price, if the world is ready for this, okay, you will see it. But it's tragedy. It will be tragedy for all of us, not only for Ukraine, not only for Ukrainians, for all Europe. And you will see that they will go. Putin will never stay, will never stop. He will go through Eastern Europe because he wants it.
Meanwhile, the International Monetary Fund and Ukraine have reached a staff-level agreement on updated economic policies, paving the way to release roughly $880 million once approved by the board. The agreement came after 6 days of meetings between Ukrainian officials and IMF staff in Poland as part of a third review of Ukraine's $15.6 billion four-year extended fund facility agreement with the IMF. The IMF said Ukraine's progress was broadly on track and the nation met all structural benchmarks under the review. Russia's Gazprom, the state-owned gas company, said on Friday it will transport 42.4 billion cubic meters of gas to Europe through Ukraine. Russia's been exporting gas to Europe for 5 years and pays Ukraine for the use of its gas pipeline network. The contract has continued despite the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict since February 2022. However, since then, Russian gas supplies to Europe have decreased significantly. The European Union said it does not see the need to extend the agreement ahead of its scheduled expiry at the end of the year. DD India's Dasha Charneshova reports from Moscow.
Well, the goals remain the same, and the Russian officials do insist that demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine are still the main goals that have been outlined by the Russian president almost 2 years ago, and they are still valid. We also understand that Moscow would be interested in embarking on the peaceful negotiations, but provided the Ukrainians do want those talks. And in the perception of the Russian officials, Ukraine does not want those talks because they have outlawed them by taking a law which prohibits the Ukrainian officials to hold peace negotiations with Moscow. Having said that, we constantly keep hearing from the Russian officials that Moscow is prevailing in this ongoing conflict with Ukraine, and those goals will be achieved through a period of time. They never outline what time that would be, but very interestingly, we have just recently heard from the former president Dmitry Medvedev, who is also the deputy chairman of the Russian Security Council, suggesting that to achieve the goals that have been set by President Putin, Moscow may go as far as to take Kiev, which Moscow says should be liberated in order to make sure that there is no threat coming from the Ukrainian side against the Russian Federation, suggesting by that Kiev is being used by the Western countries to make a threat against Russia. Also, another prerequisite for the end of this operation is that Ukraine recognizes the new realities on the ground, as the Russian officials described that, referring to the very fact that Moscow now has 4 new regions in the Russian Federation.
Russian President Vladimir Putin has claimed nearly all of Russia's strategic nuclear forces have been modernized. He also announced the delivery of 4 new supersonic, nuclear-capable bombers to the Russian Air Force. Putin's comments coincide with Russia's Defender of the Fatherland Day, which celebrates the men fighting in the armed forces. Before the Hungarian parliament votes on Sweden's NATO membership, Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson will meet his Hungarian counterpart Viktor Orbán. Hungary's delay in approving Sweden's NATO bid sparked tensions. Kristersson's visit is being interpreted as an olive branch to Hungary. The vote in Parliament is set to end delays of more than 18 months that caused frustration among Hungary's allies, with Hungary being the sole member yet to approve Sweden's bid. DD India's Pablo Gutierrez has more from Budapest.
Well, that's right. 3 days before the Hungarian parliament expected vote on approving Sweden for membership in NATO, Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson will meet his Hungarian counterpart here in Budapest. Hungary's delay in approving Sweden's NATO bid, insisting on a meeting between Prime Minister Viktor Orbán and his Swedish counterpart, first sparked tensions between the two countries. Kristersson said he was open to the meeting with the Prime Minister here in Hungary only after the ratification. Now, Orbán's Fidesz party lawmakers had persistently impeded voting on Sweden's NATO bid, hitting back at Sweden for its criticism of what it calls backsliding of democracy in Hungary. However, political analysts see the Swedish PM's visit to Hungary ahead of the vote as an olive branch. Meanwhile, Orban said that it would be a pleasure to welcome Christensen to Budapest, saying they will be discussing how to bolster defense and security cooperation between both countries. He added that the meeting agenda would also encompass plans for the Hungarian presidency of the Council of the European Union and the EU's strategic agenda. Hungary's ruling party proposed holding the vote February 26th on the ratification of Sweden's NATO bid and announced also its support for Sweden's accession. Now, Swedish Defense Minister Paul Johnson welcomed the development, emphasizing Sweden's enthusiasm to join the Atlantic Alliance, which was prompted by Russia's invasion of Ukraine back in February of 2022. Now, last weekend, a bipartisan group of U.S. senators visited Hungary to urge the government to progress on this matter, although no Hungarian government official met with them. Accepting new members also is required for the alliance. They require unanimous consent, and Hungary is the sole NATO member yet to approve Sweden's NATO bid. Reporting for DD India in Budapest, I'm Pablo Gutierrez.
At least 4 people have been killed and 15 are still missing in a fire that engulfed an apartment building in Valencia in eastern Spain. The blaze originated on the 4th floor of a residential building situated in an upscale neighbourhood of Spain's 3rd largest city before spreading to adjacent units. Firefighters were seen inspecting the building with cranes and drones before entering. Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez expressed condolences to those affected. That's it from me here in London. Back to you, Tanvi, in the studio.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Happy weekend to you. Stuart Smith joining us all from London. You're watching Did India Global. Still to come on the show. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi unveils statue of 14th century mystic and poet Sant Ravidas in Varanasi, inaugurates multiple projects including the National Institute of Fashion Technology. And the first private sector commercial space lander, Odysseus, lands on the moon. NASA calls it another giant leap for mankind.
When the equilibrium is disrupted or too much technology, even if it is green, and how does all of this impact human lives?
When we moved into regenerative agriculture, so as Namti for the last 20+ years, we've been doing chemical-free organic agriculture as such.
India's first all-women waste management team as waste collectors, supervisors, drivers and managers. Together, they handle the refuse of an entire Chennai neighborhood.
Jute is actually such a crop that it can fix the atmospheric carbon dioxide, and within 120 days it can absorb 15 tons of carbon dioxide per hectare.
Everything we produce here stays in our community. We don't want to sell our energy to the big companies. We want affordable, climate-friendly electricity for all our citizens.
Why is Welcome back. You're watching DD India Global. I am Tanvi Taneja. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi launched multiple development projects worth over $1.56 billion in the northern state of Uttar Pradesh today. The Indian Prime Minister was on a 2-day visit to the state. The projects cater to important sectors such as road, rail, aviation, tourism, education, health, drinking water, urban development, textile and sanitation. Providing impetus to the famous textile sector of Varanasi city, PM Modi also laid the foundation stone of the National Institute of Fashion Technology in Varanasi. Further, he also inaugurated the Amul Banas dairy plant in Varanasi. Banas Dairy, the largest dairy plant of the Dairy Company of India, Amul, is built at a cost of $75 million. It is expected to provide employment to nearly 100,000 people in the region. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi also attended a public function commemorating 647th birth anniversary of Indian mystic poet Saint Guru Ravidas. At the event, he also unveiled and paid floral tributes to the statue of Saint Guru Ravidas. He also offered prayers at the poet's birthplace.
जब भी देश को जरूरत हुई है, कोई न कोई संत, ऋषि, महान विभूति भारत में जन्म लेते हैं। रविदास जी तो उस भक्ति आंदोलन के महान संत थे, जिसने कमजोर और विभाजित हो चुके भारत को नई ऊर्जा दी थी। रविदास जी ने समाज को आजादी का महत्व भी बताया था और सामाजिक विभाजन को भी पाटने का काम किया। ऊंच नीच, छुआछूत, भेदभाव, इस सब के खिलाफ उन्होंने उस दौर में आवाज उठाई थी।
More from India. On the third and last day of the 9th edition of Raisina Dialogue in capital New Delhi, India's External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar said that India has a strong view on the need to reform the United Nations. He was speaking on the session named the Wonk Tank, where expertise meets authority. Jaishankar said that the UN is a reflection of a colonial era and that different models have been presented to reform the UN.
So long as Africa and Latin America and parts of the decolonized Asia are not adequately and appropriately reflected, the UN is still actually a reflection of a colonial era organization. So I think it's a great idea. I really think that, posing the reform issue in terms of perpetuating a colonial era is something which we all need to think about.
On India and China's relationship, Dr. S. Jaishankar said that maintaining an equilibrium would be challenging.
I think management, arriving at equilibriums, then maintaining those, refreshing those, is going to be one of the biggest challenges for both countries. The mind games which will be played would be, it's just between the two of us. There's nobody, the other 190 odd countries in the world don't exist in our relationship. Don't give another country, which is clearly a competitive country, a veto over our policy choices.
So a lot of foreign leaders presented their views at the Raisina Dialogue in New Delhi. Japan's significant pension fund not being utilized effectively in the region amidst multiple challenges was also discussed. Our correspondent Jessica Taneja spoke to Osamu Yamamoto, CEO of Unison Capital in Japan, on this. Take a look.
We have with us Dr. Osamu Yamamoto from the Unison Capital in Japan. Thank you for taking our time to speak with us. You were talking about gaps in private sector funding, especially when we talk about the Indo-Pacific strategy and the kind of investments that are still awaited and that have already been done. Tough negotiations happen behind all the conversation and policy-making decisions that we see in the end. Tell us about that.
My point is the following. Japan has the world's largest pension fund that has an asset of 1.8 trillion US dollar. That's a huge asset. But they have almost zero exposure in this region. And that's the gap I was talking about. And there's a gap, there's a reason. The reason is, my friend, they are the guardian of our pension. All the developed nations, including Japan, including Australia, New Zealand, they all have a huge pension asset. And they all have a very professional team. And since they are the guardian of your pension, my pension, they are very risk averse. So it's not that they don't understand the narrative that the minister from Vietnam just shared with us. There's a huge need of capital in this region, period.
What more do India and Japan need to do in terms of increasing trade ties and perhaps moving beyond just their traditional sectors?
Japan, India, Indo-Japan has a highest level G2G relationship, and we all know that. But the gap, once again, is the private sector. But in this case, private sector, both financial institutions and also the Japanese corporates are now seeking India as a land of opportunity. We have a technology in Japan, but our market is saturated. Also, there's a geopolitical reason why they have to shift their manufacturing site to India. So that is going to happen as well.
Indian business activity grew at its fastest rate in 7 months in February as demand for manufacturing and services remained robust. HSBC's Flash India Composite Purchasing Managers Index, that is PMI, compiled by S&P Global, rose to 61.5 in February this year, which is a 7-month high. This is the 31st consecutive month that the PMI has been above 50, which separates expansion from contraction. Purchasing Managers Index is a survey-based economic indicator designed to provide a timely insight into business conditions of a country. While flash PMIs are released a few days before the actual PMI numbers, which include 3/4 of the responses in the final calculation come, India is the 8th country in the world to launch flash PMI reading in January this year. And now we take a look at other stories making news around the world. 15 people died when a truck plunged from a cliff in Negros Oriental province of Philippines. The tragic accident happened when the truck's brake malfunctioned, causing the driver to lose control of the steering wheel. The police will file charges of reckless imprudence, resulting to multiple homicide and physical injuries against the driver. A chain of car accidents occurred on an icy stretch of an expressway in southwest China. Multiple cars were seen clumped together haphazardly on the highway. At least 9 people were injured in the accident. The cause of the accident is under investigation. And the United States has landed on the moon after half a century. The Odysseus spacecraft, built and flown by the Houston-based company, sailed around the moon on Thursday, made the first U.S. touchdown on the lunar surface in 50 years. The vehicle, targeting a crater near the moon's south pole, is carrying a suite of scientific instruments and technology demonstrations for NASA and several commercial customers, designed to operate for 7 days on solar energy before the sun sets over the polar landing site. So with that, it's a wrap in this edition of DD India Global. Do let us know your thoughts on the news of the day. Connect with us on Facebook, X, formerly Twitter, and Instagram. You can also find us online at ddindia.co.in. We will be back with more news as it breaks here on DD India. I am Tanvi Taneja from my entire team in New Delhi. Thank you for watching. Namaskar.